Our monthly meeting will meet here again on February 5th. Meetings in March and April will be at the new Civic Center. At some point this spring, we will be asking for your feedback as to which of these venues you prefer. Many of you attend the Calvin January series via a video feed at Christ Memorial Church. For those of you who would like to hear one of these speakers in person, the Special Events Committee has made arrangements to attend Rachel Den Hollanders' presentation on January 22nd. Ms. Den Hollander, an advocate and educator, became known internationally in 2016 as the first woman to file a police report against and also speak publicly against Larry Nassar. Last year, she was named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in the world. Room is still available for the bus trip on the 22nd. If you have not signed up for this short day trip, please consider joining us. We have reserved seating at Calvin's Covenant Fine Arts Center. A story. Two elderly ladies who belong to HASP have been friends since their 30s. Now in their 80s, they still get together a couple of times a week and play cards. One day, they were playing gin rummy, and one of them said, "You know, we've been friends for many years, and please don't get mad, but for the life of me, I can't remember your name. Please tell me what it is." Her friend glared at her. She continued to glare and stare at her for at least 3 minutes. Finally, she said, "How soon do you need to know?" Carla Verschure, our membership chairperson, will now introduce guests and new HASP members.
Thank you, Larry. I'm glad that all of you found your way to our new location. In addition to our members, we have 21 guests who made their way here today. If you are a guest or visitor, would you stand so that we can acknowledge you? Good. Thank you and welcome. We also have 12 new members we're going to be introducing to you this morning. Now at the Hayworth Center, we always asked you to come forward. That's a little difficult with rows of seats. So we're going to ask you to stand as I call your name and turn and face the others so they can get a good look at you. And then we'll give you an official HASP welcome. So we'd like to welcome Erlene Bailey, Jim Brondike, Ginger Dykstra, Nancy Hardy and Tom Hardy, who were members previously and are being reinstated, David Herman, Jim Langland, Marion Langland, Sharon Mormon, Sharon Van Putten, Ben Van Sloten, and Lori Vermeulen. Welcome. You may be seated.
Thank you, Carla. Claudia Berry from our monthly program committee will now introduce the speaker.
Thank you, Larry. In this era of fake news, alternative facts, our speaker today will share with us examples of popular and potent false beliefs and explain how such things come to be. He will also examine possible biases and successful remedies for such biases within his own field of psychological science. David Myers is a social psychologist and one of the foremost communicators of psychological science to the general public. His scientific writings, supported by National Science Fund Foundation grants and fellowships, have appeared in dozens of academic periodicals. His research and writings have been recognized by the Gordon Allport Prize, an honored scientist award from the Federation of Associations in Brain and Behavioral Science, and by 3 honorary doctorates. David has been recognized for his efforts in transforming the way America provides assistive listening for people with hearing loss through the hearing loop. Over 90 churches in the Holland-Zeeland area have taken advantage of installing the hearing loop. Also at DeWitt Theater, Hope College Miller Concert Hall, Hope College, and many other public and private locations throughout the Holland and Zeeland area. All of us who have experienced some degree of hearing loss are truly grateful for the hearing loop. A native of Seattle, an all-weather bicyclist, an avid noontime basketball player, please join me in welcoming David Myers, Thinking Smart in a Post-Truth Age.
Thank you. Thank you. And while we wait for the screen to come up, let me remember a memory story of my own that was reminded me by Larry. And this is a true story. At my 50th college reunion, a classmate walked up to a fellow classmate and said, "You look familiar, but I can't quite place who you are." The outraged woman was his first wife. And my wife later had to explain to her, "Well, you know, Marianne, we all have changed a lot." So it's great to be here, seeing so many HASP friends, looking forward to being a HASP member myself someday, and to think with you about this post-truth age, which refers to public opinion more often being shaped these days by emotion than by fact. Often our personal opinion, our unchecked intuition, our irrational fears collide with simple, basic fact. This is recognized by Time magazine, which is asking, "Is truth dead?" Scott Adams, the creator of Gilbert, has a new book, "Persuasion in a World Where Facts Don't Matter." The New Yorker offers us a cartoon show, "Facts Don't Matter." I'm sorry, Jeannie, your answer was correct, but Kevin shouted his incorrect answer over yours, so he gets the points. There's bipartisan agreement that this is a problem in today's post-truth world. Rex Tillerson, Republican, says if we become accepting of alternative realities that are no longer grounded in facts, then we as American citizens are on a pathway to relinquishing our freedom. John McCain echoes the thought, being alarmed about the growing inability and even unwillingness to separate truth from lies. Barack Obama, in his last words to the nation as president, lamented a threat to democracy growing from a lack of common baseline of facts and from underappreciating that science and reason matter. Hillary Clinton has lamented the U.S. being in a war on truth, facts, and reason. These are the concerns. Now for some examples. What do you think? Is crime this year compared to last year rising the same or less than it was? This is a question that Gallup has put every year to Americans for several decades now. And as you can see, over the last decade, every year, 7 in 10 Americans say there's more crime this year than there was last year. Last year, they said the same thing compared to the previous year. President Trump, shortly after he took office, decried the murder rate as the highest it's been in 47 years. His Attorney General, shortly thereafter, echoed that rising crime is a dangerous permanent trend. That was the belief. This is the fact, assimilated by the Attorney General's FBI, showing the reported violent crime rate aggregated from local law enforcement agencies across the United States. Property crime rate has showed similar decline. The National Crime Victimization Survey done by the U.S. government of the general public also shows violent crime and property crime has been plummeting for the last 3 decades, even though the public perceives that it's been going up. What about unemployment? At the end of the Obama presidency, 2/3 of those who voted for President Trump said unemployment increased during the Obama administration. Here's what happened to unemployment during the Obama administration. It increased during the first few months as the recession was coming to an end, and after that it plummeted to near the level it is now. What about immigration? President Trump will be giving us some strong words tonight at 9 o'clock, and has earlier said that when Mexico sends its people, who are these people? They're bringing drugs, crime, rapists. Every day, he said last October, sanctuary cities are unleashing vicious predators and bloodthirsty killers. Criminal elements are pouring in. He told us at the time of the caravan coming north through Mexico. Gallup, surveying Americans, find that as a general public, we've heard that message. We're 5 times more likely to say that immigrants make the crime situation worse rather than better. Immigrants, particularly undocumented immigrants, cause crime. Is that true? Are immigrants disproportionately represented among those arrested and imprisoned? The conservative Wall Street Journal calls that a myth. The libertarian Cato Institute says that with few exceptions, immigrants are less crime-prone than natives or have no effect on crime rates. And they recently published this analysis showing the incarceration rates by native-born Americans, that's the blue bar, and undocumented immigrants, the orange bar, at about half that of native-born Americans. I've so far given you examples of kind of partisan bias that make conservative or Republican Trump-leaning individuals look bad. But this bias is bipartisan. It cuts both ways. And so recent research assimilating all the available data through what's called a meta-analysis, a statistical digest, has found partisan bias in both liberals as well as conservatives, and at virtually identical levels. To give you an example, what about this? Did inflation rise or fall during the Reagan presidency? That's a question that was asked of the American public at the end of Ronald Reagan's presidency. And among strongly identified Democrats, only 8% thought inflation had gone down, when in fact the inflation rate had dropped like that during the Reagan presidency. Democrats, somehow living through dropping inflation, didn't see what was about them. Consider some other examples of dramatic contrast between simple facts and public beliefs. Are eating genetically modified foods safe? Yes, say 37% of U.S. adults and 88% of members of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Is climate change mostly due to human activity? I think we're seeing change on this now, but as of 3 or 4 years ago, 50% of U.S. adults and 97% of climate scientists said yes. Just this last weekend, Nicholas Kristof noted in the New York Times that 9 in 10 Americans believe world poverty is worsening or unchanging. A new book just out by Hans Rosling entitled Factfulness, which I was given at a Macmillan sales conference this last weekend, shows the facts to be exactly the opposite. World poverty, hunger rates, no matter how we look at the data, it is plummeting rapidly. The world is getting to be a better place. Nevertheless, Kristof notes, 35%, the average American thinks 35% of the world's children are vaccinated. That was true back in the early 1980s. Today, 88% of children in the world are vaccinated. By the way, Rosling in this book gives us all kinds of other trends of bad things going down, like legal slavery up in the upper left, child labor in the upper right, world hunger in the lower right. and of good things increasing. Going down the right column, girls in school, electricity coverage, clean water accessibility, immunization rates. So much good news out there, and yet that's not what the public is perceiving. So, there's a lot of factual misunderstanding in this post-truth world where opinion, ignorance, emotion trumps reality. What explains this? In part, there's some simple explanations like fake news, lies in the guise of news, intentionally meant to deceive us, particularly amplified by the power of the internet. There's also examples where mere satire has gone viral and been taken to be truth. Trump threatens to skip remaining debates if Hillary's there. Or how about these from the recent New Yorker? After he announced that he was leaving Syria, Trump named Man of the Year by ISIS. Or Pelosi says she will skip Trump and negotiate directly with Putin. Another, and now veering a little more into the psychologically interesting phenomenon, is a phenomenon called truth bias. And it's the human tendency instinctively to believe what we're told. We have great difficulty discriminating truth from lies. If somebody is instructed to tell us a bold lie or to tell us a truth, it's hard to tell the difference. We're not good lie detectors. And we're genetically predisposed to believe other people, because usually they do tell the truth. Second, and more powerful phenomenon is the power of mere repetition. If we hear over and over again, vaccines cause autism, climate change is a hoax, Muslim terrorism is a grave threat, and then we hear that over and over and over again, people start believing. Is Muslim terrorism a great threat? Since 9/11, there have been 230,000 murders in the United States, of which essentially none, 123, were committed by Muslim terrorists. Snopes checked out the claim that toddlers kill more Americans than terrorists. That's toddlers who get their hands on guns, and found that to be a true claim. What explains the power of repetition? It's in part that it makes statements, whether they are true or false statements, first easier to process. We become more fluid. What's familiar feels true, and as well as being just easier to say. It rolls off the tongue easier. Plus, it becomes easier to remember. The more we hear something, ironically, even sometimes explained by somebody who's trying to discount something, that attempt at discounting can backfire because it reminds us of the very claim that people are trying to discount. Hitler had understood this. All effective propaganda must be limited to a very few points and must harp on these in slogans. Over and again. Say it again. Third kind of psychological ingredient of this post-truth, fact-free thinking gets even more interesting, and it's what we call the availability heuristic, which is the tendency to judge, as a kind of a quick rule of thumb, how likely things are by how easily we can call instances of those things to mind, how readily available they are in our memory. So, for example, an immigrant killing Molly Tibbetts is a very vivid, memorable event. A person came in from Mexico illegally and killed her. We need the wall. We need our immigration laws changed. It's a powerful anecdote. By the way, her father was dismayed at the administration's use of that anecdote, noting that a person who was killed of taking Molly's life is no more a reflection of the Hispanic community as white supremacists are of all white people. Take any demographic group, any subpopulation of people, Norwegian hairdressers, and you can find instances of people that have done terrible things and use them as anecdotes, if that's going to be the basis for your making judgments. By the way, this power of the availability heuristic, that is misjudging sometimes the frequency with which things happen by how readily available vivid instances of those things come to mind, works the other direction too. So my wife Carol came downstairs a while ago, just irritated after Donald Trump became president because of how foreign tourists were being mistreated by our immigration authorities. A distinguished Australian children's author was wrongly detained at Los Angeles airport, missed her conference, and it's just horrid what's happening in the country these days. I said, please, dear, time out. I'm really sad about what happened to Mem Fox, but she's one person. I had to look up. There were 50.8 million people that entered the United States on tourist visas last year, and we know now about one of them. Does that tell us the general truth of the whole population? No, we need data for that. Or here's another possibly more controversial example. In the aftermath of school shootings, we've developed a tremendous fear of school shootings because those are very vivid, cognitively available events that happen to people. And so we're arming school guards, we're spending incredible amounts of money, we're alarmed and scared easily. A majority of U.S. teens now fear a shooting could happen at their school. Most parents share their concern. Kids are afraid. When in fact, an analysis of what you really should be afraid about by a Harvard risk expert notes that the odds of a child's being shot and killed at school on any given day, even in the aftermath of all the terrible things that have happened, is far, far lower than almost any other mortality risk a child faces, including driving to school. That's a greater risk. Just as for any of us flying anywhere in the world, the most dangerous part of our journey is the drive to the Grand Rapids airport. Once you're in the care of Delta Airlines, relax, you are safe. Although people's fears don't align with those facts. So we say in psychological science, let's teach it. The plural of anecdote is not data. And we need to educate students and educate people to look at the facts, at the data, at the larger picture. Another psychological dynamic that drives false belief is known and has become popularly known, I'm very pleased to say, as the confirmation bias. And it's our human yearning to look for information that confirms rather than disconfirms our pre-existing beliefs. T.S. Eliot had the idea that what often happens, we shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive right where we started, because we're seeking confirming information rather than testing our beliefs or the decisions we're about to make by inviting disconfirming information. By the way, as a textbook author, my editors and I constantly have to remind ourselves of the need to challenge our own thinking and thus to send our material out to what we think might be our severest critics to invite their response so we can anticipate what might be coming. To believe is to see. Two-thirds of what we believe is behind our eyes because of partly this confirmation bias. And so, for example, at the time of the last presidential election, of those who were favorable to President Trump, by a 5-to-1 margin, they thought President Obama was a Muslim rather than a Christian. Of those who were unfavorable to Donald Trump, by a 5-to-1 margin, they thought Donald Trump was a Christian rather than a Muslim. They're presented with the same information. We've lived through the same 8 years of the Obama administration. How is it that these two groups have such radically opposite, not just slightly different, but radically opposite opinion? It's partly because of the tremendous power of confirmation bias. And the last phenomenon I'd note is just something that's near and dear to me because it's where I cut my eye teeth in social psychology. It's called the group polarization phenomenon. It's the tendency of when you group people together of shared opinion, and that's what we tend to do both on the internet and in real life, to find that our initial inclinations are amplified by this group interaction. And so in one of our experiments done in Grand Rapids area high schools, we identified relatively high and low prejudice high school seniors. We then came back and had them in small groups discuss some racial issues pertinent to, for example, to human rights versus property rights in groups of fellow high prejudice or groups of fellow low prejudice students. And we ascertained their attitudes before and after. And as you can see, both sides felt more strongly about what they initially felt as a result of this interaction with like-minded others. And the internet now has become an opportunity writ large for people to connect with news sites, blogs, and other people who think like they do, and to defriend or whatever those who don't think like they do. And in fact, if you study, there are now a number of studies of internet links that finds that, no surprise, kindred spirited blogs, for example, are linking people and taking people to one another. And thus, no surprise, polarization has dramatically increased in the nation. If you think it has, you're right about that. Here's the percentage of people from a recent national survey who say they hate the other party. That's gone from, at the turn of the century, about 2 in 10 Americans to nearly 5 in 10 Americans today. Would you want your daughter to marry one? This is a deep kind of dimension of prejudice and polarization in the nation. So to recap what we've said so far, we do live in a post-truth world, it seems, where often opinion, emotion, intuition, irrational fears trump simple facts. And that is so for a variety of reasons, including some psychologically interesting reasons like the truth bias, the power of repetition, the power of the availability heuristic, confirmation bias, and group polarization. Well, if that's the problem, and if that's a partial explanation in brief, might my discipline, psychological science, and might academia more broadly be a solution? Or is it part of the problem? Is it itself biased? And that's a very interesting question, and we actually have some data. And let me look at it from the perspective of my discipline as a social psychologist. There have been a number of articles on the liberal bias in my discipline. The liberal bias against Republicans, the liberal bias hurting social psychology. We need more political diversity within our discipline. Is it true? Are social scientists and social psychologists in particular progressive in their political leanings? Does this bias the information that they're therefore discovering and teaching students? Well, yes to the liberal bias. Here's surveys of American college faculty showing the blue line, that's far left, self-described far left or liberals. That's 60% of American college professors. Far right and conservative, that's now down to close to 10%. Academia is not entirely, it's not uniform, but it does tend to be progressive or liberal. What about social psychologists? Back in 2011, I attended the national meeting of my profession. There was about 1,000 people in the audience when my friend and colleague John Haidt did a little survey, and he asked, show of hands, how many of you would you say you're liberals? And about 80 to 90% of hands, as I could see from looking around the room, went up. How many of you would describe yourselves as centrists or moderates? About 20 hands went up. Libertarians, about a dozen. How many of you are conservatives? 3 hands went up among about 1,000 people in the room. I was thinking as I watched that, I hope the New York Times isn't here. But it was, and it reported on that. Moreover, a survey of members of the elite Society for Experimental Social Psychology asked them who they voted for in a recent presidential election and found that 305 voted for President Obama and 4 voted for Mitt Romney. So, first point, there is liberal progressive tendencies among people in the behavioral sciences and social psychology in particular. But does that then contaminate the research we do and the information we make available? And what I want to suggest to you is that you can credit psychological scientists, first of all, for letting data speak, even if it surprises them or contradicts their own prior opinions. And I'm going to give you some examples of this. First, from some just kind of shocking, surprising findings that have changed what we believe, changed what I believe. Second, some findings that affirm conservative principles. And third, some findings that affirm progressive principles, because these findings do all of it. Okay, first, just some surprising discoveries. Who would have guessed that electroconvulsive therapy works? It's an effective antidote for otherwise disabling depression. We don't completely understand why it works. It makes no sense in some ways. It seems brutal, although it's much less brutal than it used to be because of how it's administered now, but it works. It just occurs to me a pun. It's a shocking finding. Or what about this? This is really a shocker. The effect of parents in shaping their children's personality and intelligence is close to nil. That violates everything we understand. But that comes to us from behavior genetic studies that find such a minimal effect of shared environment. This comes to us through adoption studies that find that two adopted children from different backgrounds who grow up in the same family are hardly more similar to one another in personality and intelligence and so forth than they are to other randomly selected children. Or from twin studies. More than 14.6 million twins have now been studied and their data aggregated. And the grand conclusion is that across all traits, the reported heritability, that's the extent to which individuals differ as a result of their genetic differences, is 49%. And the data are inconsistent with substantial influences from shared environment. Now, parents have other effects on values, religious faith, and things like that, but it's just kind of a surprising, shocking finding. Or what about seasonal affective disorder? This is a little clip from Grand Rapids Press of 2 days ago telling us about this potent phenomenon. It's wintertime blues season. I believe this. It's in the American Psychiatric Association Diagnostic Manual. It's in my textbook. And yet, consider some new data out recently in Clinical Psychological Science. What these researchers did is draw data from Centers for Disease Control interviews with more than 34,000 Americans about their daily moods and experiences. And they were able to ask, is depression more common? In fact, are people experiencing more depressed moods around the winter solstice? Are they expressing more depressed moods if they live in cloudy areas in the winter? Are they more depressed on cloudy days? Are they more depressed in higher latitudes with less winter light? And the answer is no, 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 and no. None of those things are true. Hold it. That can't be so. We've been teaching seasonal affective disorder. So I did a little test using Google Trends, and what I did is I, first of all, tested to make sure this would work by testing the the frequency of people's searches for different words across the months of the year. So I put in basketball. I love basketball, as was mentioned. And as you can see, there's very few searches for the term basketball in summer. They increase in winter and they peak in March, okay? So this is just validating that you can see what people are thinking about from their Google searches across time. Or flu, that's low in summer. There's a lot more searches for the word flu in winter, because flu is seasonal, okay? So what about depression? That's the blue line. Or sad. It's a little less in July and August, but from September to May, there's virtually no change in people's searches for the word depression and sad. Or the phrase, I am sad, or I am depressed. Just no change across the year. So what I can say is this little analysis, this is lots of data, this confirms the CDC data showing that seasonal affective disorder seems not to exist. So what do we say? I say, with my favorite detective, Miss Marple, it wasn't what I expected, but facts are facts, and if one is proved to be wrong, one must just be humble about it and start again. Because we don't want to live in a post-truth world, we want to live in an evidence-based, fact-based world. So, give us a little bit of credit for letting the data surprise us and change our minds. It does, it happens. Let me also now just share with you some examples. Some of these examples are guaranteed to offend everybody in this room, probably, because they will challenge what you think, perhaps. First of all, some data that support some deeply held conservative beliefs. First, we have massive evidence from some countries, and the United States is certainly among them, that frequent religious engagement with a faith community is associated with improved health, life expectancy, charity, including both charitable giving and volunteerism, and what we call subjective well-being, feelings of happiness and life satisfaction. Secondly, what's called a growth mindset, teaching, for example, at-risk middle school kids to regard their brains as a muscle that can be developed by their own hard work, leads to greater achievement. Norman Vincent Peale and Robert Schuller would savor this finding and this principle of growth mindset, strengthening one's own positive thinking. Or here's an example where I went, and others did too, looking for and expecting to find sexism, but didn't find it. There was a famous finding some years ago in which students were given an essay that was said to be written either by John McKay or Joan McKay. and gave it lower ratings when it was attributed to the female. I thought, wow, that's really a cool, simple phenomenon. I want to demonstrate this to my class and show them their own sexism. And so I replicated the experiment more than once. It didn't work. There was no difference. So with a student here at Hope, we set about to look for every study on the effect of people's judgment of work attributed to a man or a woman that was either published or unpublished. And at the end of the day, these data got published in the leading journal of kind of psychological literature reviews. And by the way, this was by a feminist women's studies student who's now a social psychologist at Penn State University, and we found no difference. The phenomenon didn't replicate. It made big news, it was splashy, but it just didn't replicate. Or take this finding by Wendy Williams and Stephen Ceci at Cornell University. Is there, as many people suppose in academia, an overabundance of males in STEM fields because of a bias against hiring women? Well, they sent resumes with either a man or a woman's name on it to a variety of job openings and found that the bias was exactly the reverse. And when they published that, they were roundly attacked. The myth that academic science isn't biased against women is just terrible. I mean, these people should be castigated and so forth. And they responded with, hey, our guiding principle has been to follow the data wherever it takes us. This isn't necessarily what we expected to find, but it's what the data show, and we're ethically obliged to publish it. Or here's another kind of shocking finding. It's called the phenomenon of stereotype accuracy. Stereotypes sometimes exaggerate a kernel of truth, but they may contain a kernel of truth. And Lee Jussum at Rutgers has for years with his collaborators been arguing that stereotype accuracy is one of the largest and most replicable findings in all of social psychology. People observe real differences, and they notice them. And those are stereotypes, but they may be true. Ted Cruz had the idea recently. It's a stereotype that Texans like barbecue. It also happens that pretty much all Texans like barbecue. That's a true stereotype, is what Ted Cruz is saying. Or what about this? Marriage and stable co-parenting are associated with human happiness, health and longevity, the flourishing of children, lower rates of poverty, especially children's poverty. If you care about children's poverty, you should care about marriage and supporting and renewing the institution of marriage. Conservatives are right. And so we have data, for example, showing the percentage of very happy married Americans over the last several decades and of never married Americans. That's a huge difference. Or look at the percentage of 3 to 17-year-olds treated for emotional or behavioral problems in the past 12 months as a function of their family's marital status. Most kids are doing fine, but as you can see on the far right, those with biological intact parents are at lowest risk. And that's after controlling for parental education, parental race, income. Still, we get these differences. Stable co-parenting and marriage help human beings flourish. They're not essential for human well-being, and many people have close supportive relationships in other ways, but marriage is a social good. And yet, of the percentage of high school seniors, look at the percentage of high school seniors who agree that most people will have, indeed, fuller and happier lives if they choose marriage. That's about 1 in 3 high school seniors today. So that would be an example of high school seniors maybe living in a fact-free world that is contrary to what reality is. So here are findings from progressive social scientists that affirm conservative thinking. But then we have other findings that go the other direction. For example, we have massive data now from a number of studies that extreme inequality is toxic to human flourishing and to social health. Places with great inequality have less happy people, they have more health and social problems, they have higher rates of mental illness. One major study did an index that aggregated all sorts of health and emotional problems in a country into a single index, and as you can see, as income inequality on the horizontal axis increases, the social problem rate in a nation also increases. And we have other data showing that nations with more progressive taxation systems have greater scores on measures of subjective well-being. They're healthier places. They're places you'd want to live, where people thrive. Or another progressive finding that does have some relevance to psychological science, namely that climate change is real. It's a likely weapon of future mass destruction. We have a new report out just this morning that CO2 rates are continuing to go up. Not surprising. Global temperatures are rising. The polar ice cap is shrinking. Extreme weather is increasing. We have new data showing that hurricanes are becoming more destructive. And as all this happens, it will have psychological consequences because people are going to be displaced from regions where there's drought or where there's been extreme weather. There's going to be increased conflict with increased immigration. This is all part of the human future. Or what about this? We know, and I've written a whole book on this, and talk about this at length, that sexual orientation, especially so for males, is a natural, enduring disposition. And it's something not easily changed. And that, just to give you one example, this was illustrated. We know a lot about the brain science and everything that influences sexual orientation, but efforts to change it have pretty well come to naught. And again, that's especially the case with males. For example, a recent study looked at more than 1,600 same-sex attracted Mormons. 2/3 of them had attempted to change their sexual orientation one way or another. Overall, 0% were successful in doing so. Less than 4% reported any change at all in their sexual orientation. So, what have we said? We live in a post-truth world, the Oxford Dictionary has said, and it seems like that's sort of true. That's true partly because of fake news and some other things that we easily understand, and also because of some interesting psychological mechanisms that drive misinformation. Truth bias, repetition, the availability heuristic, confirmation bias, group polarization. Is academia the answer? Is psychological science a partial antidote, or is it just too liberal? Well, it is liberal, but give us a little credit for being willing to let the data tell its truth, as exhibited both in some surprising examples and some findings that contradict our own, speaking collectively as social psychologists, leanings. Finally, I want to just suggest to you how science, education, and humility born of an authentic religious faith are a vital antidote to the misinformation of our age, of our fact-free age. We who are educators, and for myself as a textbook writer with a large audience, try to teach our students a scientific attitude that helps them appreciate both the findings that they're going to be reading, but also that they can carry into their daily lives as thoughtful, educated people. And it's an attitude that, first of all, grows from a spirit of curiosity, of wonder. Does it work? When put to the test, can its predictions be confirmed? Secondly, an attitude not of cynicism, which kind of disbelieves everything, but of healthy skepticism, which always asks, what do you mean? How do you know that? And thirdly, this spirit of humility that is willing to be surprised, to follow new ideas, to have one's mind changed, to realize that one has been wrong and to start over again or go in a different direction. This kid has the idea, what do we want? Evidence-based science. When do we want it? After peer review. Science and the scientific attitude is a partial antidote to the post-truth era. Second, education. Education works. It supports critical analytical thinking. And we now have some pretty compelling data that the more educated people are, the less vulnerable they are to believing in ill-formed conspiracy theories. And finally, I just want to say, well, not quite finally, but near finally, a word about how an authentic religious spirit and theism gives rise both to science and to the spirit of humility. If you're a theist, there's two things you believe. One is you believe there is a God, and the second thing you believe is that it's not you and it's not me. And if you believe those two things, then it necessarily follows that the surest belief you can hold is that some of your beliefs err, because you're not God. And therefore, you and I should hold our own untested beliefs tentatively. Everything I believe is subject to correction. And if somebody proves me wrong, it's no threat to me, because I know I'm wrong in some ways. And so we just change our mind and go on. We should assess others' ideas with open-minded skepticism. Just because somebody says it doesn't mean it's true. Doubt has its place. Put ideas to the test. Seek the relevant evidence. And when appropriate, use observation and experimentation to winnow error from truth. Now, observation and experimentation don't decide all of the important questions of life, but they're relevant to a good many of them. And by the way, this is an attitude that comes out of the religious tradition that I'm a part of. We find it in the Old Testament. If a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord and what he says does not come true, then it's not the Lord's message. Put it to the test. This is empiricism. Or Jeremiah, when the word of that prophet comes true, then it will be known that the Lord has truly sent the prophet. The proof is in the pudding. It's in the evidence. Does the evidence to support it? St. Paul, test everything. Hold fast to what is good. And that, it seems to me, is at the heart of what we know as the Reformed tradition, which is my own religious heritage as Presbyterian and now Reformed, which calls itself, and I love this, Reformed and ever reforming, which, at least in its ideal form, acknowledges that it doesn't have a corner on truth, and that truth is ever growing, knowledge is being revealed, the Spirit is working. Let's embrace evidence and be willing to change our thinking from wherever it comes. So, a big part of my mission as an educator and text author is to educate students in what we've learned about human nature and in this whole scientific attitude and this love of evidence-based thinking. Truth, it's now more important than ever. But that's not the only message I want them to get. I feel with E.B. White, rather like he says, I arise in the morning torn between the desire to save the world, we got to help people think smarter in a post-truth world, and a desire to savor the world, to appreciate the wonders of our human existence. Consider this. Imagine an alien species, if you will, that could pass thoughts from one head to another merely by pulsating air molecules in the space between them. This is just one dimension of our human existence, but that's us. As I'm speaking right now, I'm pulsating air molecules that are traveling through space, striking your eardrum, causing the bones of your middle ear to vibrate, sending fluid-filled waves up your cochlea, triggering your hair cells to send neural messages up to your brain. At the end of this amazing sequence that goes from air pressure waves to mechanical waves to fluid waves to the electrical waves that flow up to your brain, you decode that information. You hear. It's mind-to-mind communication, happening right now, transmitted by vibrating air molecules. Is this cool? Would you have thought up this system if you were there at the beginning? Seems to me, in our post-truth world, there's a need for evidence-based, fact-based thinking, but we should never lose sight of the wonders of human existence at the same time. We are, as the psalmist said, fearfully and wonderfully made, and that is something to celebrate. So that's my 2 cents, and that leaves some time for some questions.
We have one microphone for our questions this morning, so I'm going to work this aisle for a couple of questions and come back to that aisle, if I can do that. Are there some questions up here?
Mr. Myers, why do the less educated default toward conspiracy versus science or fact-based information?
So why do less educated people default toward conspiracy-based, non-scientific thinking? Well, I'd prefer to turn that question on its head. Why does education advance appreciation for science? And it's partly because education involves science education. and an awareness of what science is bringing us and of the information, insights, not to mention the technology that it makes available to us. And part of our task is also to help students learn how to ask and answer questions, not just to give them the answers, but to learn how to play the game so that they can play that game thinking scientifically, thinking smarter. And so that's very close to the heart of what education is, it seems to me.
If I could ask you to put on a somewhat different hat, do you have a sense for how this not so much came to be, but how this condition of post-truthiness has been in the past? Say when Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were flinging obscenities at each other, and how we got here, and might that show us some pathway to get out of the pit in which we find ourselves?
Wow, so I'm not a historian, so I'm not maybe the best person to answer that question. Other people here might have some thoughts, and I'd love to hear them. I think the political climate of the last 10 years or so has contributed to what we're experiencing. I also think that the growth of the internet, which is now ubiquitous, for all its blessings, and we wouldn't want to be without it. I mean, I'll go back to my office and I'll harvest its fruits freely for the rest of the day. It's fabulous. But it does give us a vehicle for connecting with people who think just like we do. When I grew up, and when many of you grew up, there were 3 major television networks, CBS, NBC, and ABC, and they brought you pretty balanced coverage. Now we can select. Do we want our evening news from MSNBC or Fox News? Do we want to read the Huffington Post? Or we have all these choices. And so in a way, it allows us to go into our tribal enclaves much more easily. The internet is facilitating that. So that's a huge development since the time of Thomas Jefferson. But that's just off the top of my head.
In your comments about marriage and the benefits of it, you referred to co-parenting, and I'm wondering if there's data that you're familiar with that would sort out co-parenting with heterosexual couples and same-sex couples.
Yes, actually, there are data on that, so that's a question I can speak to more comfortably. So I did use the word co-parenting because that refers to 2 adults who are enduringly committed to each other and to the well-being of their children, and that's without mention of the sexuality or the sexual orientation, either one of them. That's a good thing. And kids who grow up co-parented by 2 loving same-sex parents are growing up overwhelmingly healthy, just like those raised by heterosexual couples. But also, they're not growing up gay, even though they've been raised in a gay home. I mean, to a noticeably greater frequency than other kids. And so that's just, by the way, more evidence that sexual orientation is a natural, enduring disposition. It's not a result of peer influence or whether your teacher was gay or your parent was gay or anything like that. It's other things going on.
How will you treat seasonal affective disorder in future publications of yours?
Okay, that's very interesting. So the co-author, I now have a co-author of my introductory psych text, and I wanted to just kind of demolish seasonal affective disorder based on these data, which just are mammoth data, and my own searching confirms that it just doesn't exist. He thinks, there's been enough evidence supporting it, and it's still in the diagnostic and statistical manuals of psychiatric disorder, so we kind of compromised, and it's still in the book, but we now acknowledge that there's new data raising questions about whether this exists. Personally, I don't think it exists. I'm convinced it's going to disappear from the lexicon, but we'll see. I might be wrong.
Everything should be fact-based.
Well, not everything.
And yet, there are differences of opinion about what facts are. How can we be sure that we have facts and not interpretation?
Well, sure. So part of our job as educators is to help students know what's valid information and what's not. And what are, first of all, what are reputable fact-checked news sources and what aren't. I mean, that's one thing we can do. I mean, for myself as an author, I see data, and as I was just discussing with my co-author in Jacksonville at the airport yesterday, I mean, we can't cite this secondary source. We have to go back to the primary source and see the data for ourselves and to report on that, not from the secondary source. Now, the average person can't do that. I mean, they don't have the luxury of time to go to the World Health Organization data and, you know, actually confirm that what's being reported is true. But there are certain sources that we can generally trust that do that. By the way, you trust textbooks have a responsibility to do that. And to make sure that we do, our feet are held to the fire by having our work critiqued by colleague peer reviewers, you know, all across, well, I'll say the world, certainly North America. And then by all the people that read the books that tell us if we mess up and get something wrong. And so, you know, we don't like to have egg on our face, so we are very motivated to get things right. That's not to say we always do, but, you know, we work at it. Yes?
That last question opens up the issue of selective data and the manner of presentation of data that can also reveal biases, you know, just the way a chart or way a graph is presented.
Yeah.
Are there ways that we, the general public, can be on guard against manipulation of facts?
Yeah, so, yes, so how data are presented can affect how we read them. And so, for example, we have to make decisions about how we're going to calibrate the vertical axis. And we're going to put it from 0 to 100, you know, percent on some scale, or we're going to put it from 40 to 60%, in which case the effect is going to look huge, even though in fact it's very small. And so we can mislead people. It's very easy to mislead people by how you visually present the data. So that, I mean, that would just be one example of what I think is the point you're making.
In this world of alternative realities, alternative facts, one of the problems we have is our ability or inability to discuss our differences with others. I don't know how much you do in your book about it, but the problem we have, I think, is we don't know how to communicate with those with whom we disagree. Any comment on that?
Okay, could you repeat that, David? I just let David repeat it there. Thank you.
It's how do we discuss with people with whom we don't agree?
Oh, yeah, great question. So I'm at least nominally on the national, on the board of a new organization, and have given it some financial support, entitled Better Angels. And what Better Angels is doing, you can search for this on the internet, is bringing together reds and blues, as they call them, from across the country for weekend dialogue, where they bring, let's say, 10 ardent Republicans and 10 progressive ardent Democrats together for a Friday evening and an all-day Saturday, where they get to know each other better. Not their images of what the other people think, but what the other people really think and care about, to discover what their actual differences are as opposed to their perceived differences, and then to listen carefully to each other and be able to understand each other better. And at the end, come out with maybe the experiences of people are really, this is often quite transformative. They're less polarized at the end of this experience. So the question is, can we do that? I mean, in our churches, our institutions, our HASP classes and so forth, can we structure conversations? And can we ourselves seek out conversations that allow us, before expressing an opinion, first to listen to and try to understand the other's perspective, and then offer our own in return, and to identify, you know, what that margin of difference is between us, and what might be relevant to resolving that difference. What kind of information would be pertinent and useful? So thank you. That's a great question.
David, we want to thank you for a very stimulating morning. It's been one that's challenged us because some of what we thought has not proved valid, but it's also enlightened us and done so in a very winsome way. We are grateful for your expertise, your willingness to share it with us this morning, so thank you for an excellent morning.
Thank you. Thank you.